Hello everybody, welcome back to How to Make Climate Change Sexy with me, Issey Gladston. I am so excited to finally be getting this project off the ground. It's been a super fun few months making memes and seeing you all like and comment and share and just generally interact with them. But now I'm actually getting into what I wanted this project to be, which is a podcast that explores sustainable fashion and how this plays into our ecological and climate crisis. For the first episode back, it's actually going to be a collaboration episode with the book club that I run. So I co-founded Hothouse Book Club with Diora. We meet every 6 weeks IRL and online to discuss books from a climate justice perspective. This panel is from our first birthday party earlier this month, where we had Tori, Sam and Damien speak. Tori is an activist and author, Sam is from the Body Ecologies research group, and Damien is the environmental correspondent for The Guardian. In the panel talk, they explain who they are a bit better than I'll do now. But it was a really interesting conversation centered around the concept of solastalgia. So solastalgia is the emotions that we feel as we watch our environment degrade in front of us. I mentioned later on that it's something that I certainly feel about my hometown and something that is felt far, far more intensely in the global south. It was a really great conversation. It was so much fun having the book clubbers in one room and dancing with everyone afterwards. And I hope that you find the conversation interesting and there's something in it that you maybe hadn't thought about before, or maybe that you learned something. And again, I'm just super excited to be back and to be in your headphones. So without further ado, here is the first episode back. I think to start, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. My name is Tori Tsui, I use she, they pronouns. I am based in Bristol, but I'm originally from Hong Kong, and I'm a climate justice activist, writer, and also mental health advocate, and I organise with the campaign Stop Rosebank, so it's nice to see some comrades here in the audience. And on top of that, I kind of look at the intersections between music and climate, so I work with Climate Live and another organisation called Earth%.
Hi everyone, I'm Samrawit. I also go by Sam, and I'm head of communications at an NGO called Minority Rights Group International, just around the corner from here. And I'm part of an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary group called Body Ecologies, and we came together over the term Solastalgia. I'm originally Ethiopian-Italian, from Ethiopia, raised in Italy. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, I'm Damien. I'm environment correspondent at The Guardian. My work focuses on environmental activism. And I'm kind of new to the concept of solastalgia, but I've been thinking a lot about it over the past couple of weeks. And I think that it's something which I've come across quite a lot during my work, but just didn't have the language to describe it before, so I'm quite interested to share my reflections with you.
I also realised I didn't introduce myself, because I know most of you, but for the sake of the process, I'm Issey. I'm a writer and photographer and soon-to-be podcaster, and I co-founded Hothouse Book Club with Diora, who can't be with us tonight because she's still in Uzbekistan. And I also run Sexy Climate Change, where I bully Grant Shapps mercilessly until he left his position. I think it's really good when we talk about things to root our terms and make sure everyone's on the same page. So I'm going to read a section of Tori's book because she's probably sick of reading it by now.
I really am. I'm just sick of the book, full stop.
But I also don't have my glasses.
I can try and help when you need me.
Be fine, I'll squint. The work of Glenn Ulbricht has certainly diversified this discussion. Most notably, Ulbricht coined the term solastalgia, which describes a feeling of existential distress in response to the environmental degradation of a place that once was. His conceptualization of solastalgia is a deeply personal one, having materialised in response to witnessing the decimation of the Hunter River Valley in the New South Wales, Australia, for coal mining. People with solastalgia are said to feel immense grief in response to how environments near and dear to us are chronically disappearing and changing, and that the solace we get from these places also disappears with them.
lost my place. People with solastalgia embody the realities of living with this change, and thus it has often been applied to those on the front lines of climate change. To me, there is a certain poignancy, a nostalgia of sorts that solastalgia speaks to. From witnessing the degradation of coral reef ecosystems to the retreat of glacial ice, communities around the world are being impacted by the loss of environmental, cultural, and ancestral homes. So that's what solastalgia is. I was wondering if you could all speak to experiences of solastalgia in your own lives.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Issey. So mine is actually kind of one that doesn't really necessarily conventionally fit under what people think of when they come to think about solastalgia. And actually, for me, the greatest sense of loss and grief comes from political changes that have happened in Hong Kong, and especially the democratic right to free speech, and how many activists have been criminalised and killed as a result of the way in which the Chinese Communist Party are enforcing something called the National Security Law. And I actually haven't gone home, well, I went home for the first time in 5 years, back to Hong Kong, and I didn't see my family for 5 years. And when I went back, it was like walking in a really dystopian city. There was a really immense feeling of grief, and it's quite interesting because I think to those of us who might identify with like more Eurocentric understandings of climate change and injustice, we might think of the physical manifestations of something that we've lost, but for me there's a really huge social injustice as well to that, and I see political freedom as a climate injustice issue. Like, we need political freedom in order to campaign for the climate, and so for me, I think, like, most personally, that is that experience of solastalgia that I relate to, the sort of social implications of loss of political freedom.
I find this question really hard to answer because my relationship with solastalgia is very much from working with communities on the front line of the climate crisis, facing things like flooding, drought, deforestation, and lots of environmental issues. But I can speak from a personal perspective on the city of Rome, where I grew up, that I still call home, and how much of Rome's identity stemmed from this pine tree. How many people in the room have been to Rome and know what tree I'm talking about? Okay, great, exactly. So due to climate change, there is a rapidly spreading parasite, that is attacking the pine trees of Rome. And I've grown up very close to the Appian Way of Rome. And the Appian Way is known, it's a historic road, the oldest road in Italy, and it's known for its pine trees. And across Rome, some pine trees are now disappearing, and there's a lot of investment to try and save them, so there is a dread of what's to come. But for me, it was this fear of when there were fires that spread across the city last year, mixed with this fact of everyone racing to try and save the pine trees and seeing less and less of these trees. I still don't have the words to describe how I'm feeling about it. I don't recognize the city that I grew up in without those trees. And that's a very personal kind of perspective, but I also recognize the privilege I have and the fact that in cities like Rome and in the West that we have funds that can address these things. Very often we can mitigate our emotions, we can travel, try and access nature in different ways. This is the closest I've come to it from a personal perspective.
Okay, so I found solastalgia to be quite a difficult concept to begin with, because it felt to me, having grown up in South London and growing up in the city, that it wasn't really a concept that applied to me or applied to my life. The UK is already one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. It's in the top 10 most nature-depleted countries on the planet. It's the worst country for biodiversity in the G7. And 85% of us in this country already live in cities. So it got me thinking, who is it that actually experiences solastalgia in a place like the UK? Until I started thinking about this topic, I don't think I'd ever really experienced this emotion at all. I'd never experienced this state of mind of feeling grief connected to environmental destruction around me, because it felt like the environment was already completely denuded. for me, I suppose, until very recently, the closest sense that I ever came to having solastalgia was seeing gentrification happening in neighbourhoods where I grew up. So recently, the Elephant and Castle shopping centre was demolished. And that, to me, brought me a sense of grief, because this landmark, which I'd grown up with and which had been a big part of my life, suddenly was no longer there. Paradoxically, a lot of these gentrification projects are actually improving biodiversity and increasing wild nature around us. So to me, it seemed as though I was having a bit of a paradoxical response to this whole idea. And then just recently, my children are here, we went off for a few days holiday in the Peak District. And when we came home, we found that outside our front room window, there was this beautiful elder tree, which grew into this tall, kind of wildish hedge that no one had really taken care of, that separated our front garden from the front garden of our next door neighbours. And the next door neighbours, while we were away, had ripped up this hedge and torn out the tree and replaced it with, beginning to replace it with a brick wall. And we came up the road and we saw what had happened, and these piles of bricks lying on the gravel of our front garden, and I was aghast, and my children were upset as well, and my son, I think he even shed a tear, although he denies it. But I was really super angry with the next door neighbours for having done this. And I felt like going and banging on their door and asking them, do you realise what you've done? This tree, this bush was a haven for the birds would come, the local wood pigeons from Tootingbeck Common would come and sit in this bush and coo, and robins would come and sing in there. And I think that's probably the closest I've ever come to experiencing solastalgia, although it seems to be in a slightly bizarre context.
Okay, cool. I think it's interesting how you've all mentioned like your childhood homes. I think the closest experience I had was going home one Christmas, and I'm from Portsmouth, and there's like sea on all sides of the city, and seeing these like enormous rocks that had been placed in the channel. And my mum was driving, and I was like, what is going on there? And she was like, oh, that's just the sea defences. And I think it made me realise how much at risk our like community and the place that I grew up and like love is at from the climate crisis. And it did feel a lot more close than it has ever felt before. Sam and Damien, I was wondering if you could talk about how solastalgia plays into your work and how other people's experiences of solastalgia on the front lines has come into your work.
Yeah, sure, I can go first. So I was thinking about this as well, and I was thinking in the context of the work I do, which is mainly based on climate activism, much of the work I do is based on following around climate activists, seeing what they're getting up to, and also finding out their reasons for doing it. The first concrete example I can think of people articulating something like solastalgia to me was perhaps in 2019 when Extinction Rebellion began their protests in central London around Easter of that year. And I spoke to a lot of people around that time about their reasons for joining the protests. And a lot of people said to me that they felt that it was not just a response to their fear about the climate crisis, but also a response to their perception that nature was being destroyed. And one line kept coming up again and again from people, which I'm not sure where it was from, but they kept saying that they had this sense of the dawn chorus becoming a solo. And this was repeated to me so many times, I think it was probably part of Exile's political education, which makes me wonder a little bit about how genuine it really was. But that definitely seemed to me to be, looking back, my first concrete experience concrete example of someone articulating something like solastalgia to me. Solastalgia is also baked into the founding myth of Extinction Rebellion. Roger Hallam, who you might know as the kind of Svengali of climate protest in the UK, his origin myth is that he was an organic farmer in Wales who had a small holding and a business there, which was destroyed, as he said, or as he claims, by a series of freak weather events. And he says that's what provoked him to go to King's College to study methods of social change and activism. So it is very much a part of the narrative of climate activism. But a lot of the climate activists I speak to as well, when they're speaking more genuinely, they seem to be speaking more from a space of eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, which is more about their fear about what's going to happen in the future. So I'm interested in sort of seeing how these two emotions interact.
From my perspective, it might be worth just explaining a little bit about LBE, Land Body Ecologies. So Land Body Ecologies is a transdisciplinary research group, of which I'm a core member. I'm one of the founding members because we came together seeking an understanding of what mental health impacts were occurring around the world as a cause of climate change. And in my role as Minority Rights Group, at Minority Rights Group International, we have this network of over 300 partners, mainly ethnic, linguistic, religious minorities, and indigenous communities worldwide. And what we heard at MRG, my organization, for a long time was that climate change is happening right now from our partners. A lot of us in, I would say, Europe and the West, for a long time, we're talking about the fear of climate change, as Damien was saying earlier, eco-anxiety as an example. But it was really difficult to try and find a term or a way to talk about what was happening in the moment with these communities' mental health. And this network, Land Body Ecologies, is, as I mentioned, we have lots of disciplines represented. I come from a human rights perspective, but our partners, Invisible Flock, they are artists. They're the ones who brought together this group, and the purpose of art is constantly in our conversations about what role it can play to understand what suffering is. There's some suffering that you can't even put a word to. There's some suffering that's conveyed through facial expressions. There is suffering expressed through touch. And finding Solastalgia for us was the starting point of this research group because it became the term that our partners resonated with. They were talking about how that's a suffering that we want the world to understand. So that's how we came together. But one thing I really want to emphasize is what we consider facts in solastalgia. How do you diagnose solastalgia? And for me, from our work in this group, it's really about listening to narratives and creating the space to connect the dots because it's such a global problem. Land Body Ecologies, I'll just mention, while we have the hub, a hub in London, which is our kind of coordination hub in the Wellcome collection, we try and talk about this decentralized approach to say, we want to talk about mental health impacts on the front lines, for frontline communities, but how are we in the West doing this research on communities or for communities when we should be doing it either with them or be guided by them? So we have partners, I just really want to mention who's represented in this group, who are leading the research on the ground. I'm just speaking on behalf of them because of physical privilege being in London. So in Kenya, we work with the Ogiek peoples. They're an indigenous community in Mau Forest that are dealing with a lot of climate change issues, biodiversity issues, human rights issues, land eviction. And one thing that they talk a lot about is declining bee populations and how that impacts their identity. And the declining bee population is because of climate change. And for the Ogiek, that the bees and the honey, the role of honey in their community, when that is declining in real time, it is as though they as a people are disappearing. Their name, Ogiek, in Ogiek language, means caretakers of flora and fauna. Just imagine if your name was caretaker of plants and you walked around with that pride. So the one thing about solastalgia for us that's come out over these 2 years of research is really the impact of of climate change on culture, and how solastalgia often emerges through narratives of changing cultures or barriers to practicing your culture. and trying to understand who you are amidst these expressions of suffering.
I really love the work that Land Bodies Ecology do. I remember when we first met and you were telling me all about it, I felt really excited, so I would recommend checking them out like after the panel. Oh, we've just lost our visuals. Tori, in your work, you talk a lot about like the emotional toll of activism and eco-anxiety, and it's part of your book. I was wondering how do we kind of coexist with this grief and with these big feelings? Like, what have you found in your work to kind of, I don't know, like temper that darkness of activism that's there?
Yeah, I like that question because I think in many ways we almost assume that we succeed at doing so, which we don't. Actually, a lot of the time there's a lot of heartbreak and we have to learn to live with the pain. And I think sometimes when people talk about eco-anxiety or climate grief, there's this assumption of like, how do we actually overcome it? How do we get rid of it? And I always have to go back to this point, which is sometimes it's not about getting rid of it, it's about learning how to harness it or acknowledge what it's trying to tell you, because the goal isn't to get rid of these painful emotions. In fact, they're there for a reason, and I think that they're a really deep sign of what makes us human. And I would almost be like, why isn't anyone grieving? Why aren't you going like crazy, you know? And for me, when I think about how I mitigate these emotions, it's not about suppressing them, it's not about getting rid of them, it's about almost learning how to live with them in a way that feels transformative. And I find that organising, as cliche as it is one of the best ways for me to harness those.
Can you just take the wire out?
Siri had something to say about that.
Sorry.
Are we being like bugged by the government or something? Did you piss off grunt chaps too much? I know it's cliche, but organising has really allowed me to be in community with people who also experience these emotions, and I really feel like the validation that you get from being in these spaces is incredibly healing, and also part of how we transform our emotions into action. We were speaking about it yesterday, overheated, but for me, anger is such a huge part of this narrative that often gets left out of the equation. And, you know, does grief really fully encapture that anger? Does eco-anxiety? For me, not entirely. But anger is one of the biggest emotions that I feel in response to this crisis. And it's tricky, but I actually feel that it's also one of the best catalysts for me taking action and being with people who are also pissed off. That's kind of like a little explanation about how I manage it.
That kind of goes back to a conversation I had with Damien earlier about how the Brits protest compared to the French. I remember when I was at uni, I would go to environmental protests with my French friends and they'd be like, why is nothing burning? Why are people not fighting? Why is no one throwing bottles? I was kind of wondering how you see that like diversity and response in the work that you do with your like kind of reporting of activists.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And it cuts to the core of who gets to feel these emotions and why. And as I said, Extinction Rebellion and UK climate activism or UK environmental activism feels to me like it's far more motivated by eco-anxiety than it is by a feeling like solastalgia. And eco-anxiety is a very specific form of anxiety. If we think about how it's distinguished from solastalgia, eco-anxiety is something that's theoretical. It's something that connects the present with the future based on a set of scientific predictions. Whereas solastalgia feels to me, there's like something that's far more concrete. It feels as though it's something that connects the present with the past. Solastalgia is the present, the concrete sensation of feeling your home environment destroyed by human interaction. Whereas eco-anxiety is the sense that we face an unlivable and harrowing future as a result of human interaction with the environment. And it just feels as though the kinds of people who are able to feel these feelings of eco-anxiety are very different. If you look at, for example, the demographics of who takes part in an Extinction Rebellion protest, there was some research done around 2019 that found, I think it was some ridiculous proportion. Like 85% of the people who took part in those protests had a university degree. 2/3 self-identified as middle class. 1/3 had a postgraduate degree. And 1/3 of those people who were prosecuted for taking part of those protests were actually from the West Country, which is bizarre because it was in London. So who gets to feel eco-anxiety? It feels as though it's a very privileged set of people here in the UK who are even able to engage with the environmental issue to that extent that it becomes an emotional, that they feel an emotional response to it. But then I went to France in April and I covered some of the protests that were happening over there. And what's his name? The man who wrote How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Andreas Malm. Yeah.
You can tell this is a book club.
He said to me a few months ago, he says he feels as though the epicenter of environmental protests has now moved over to France. And you can see it in the way that protests take place there. They have had some really earth-shaking protests. There was one in, I think it was March, in Saint-Soline in western France against these drought reservoirs that they want to build to pump groundwater out to basically irrigate commercial agriculture. And people are furious with that. They've suffered year upon year of droughts, successive droughts in France, and people are really facing a concrete experience of climate change over there in a way that we're not here. And they have a completely different way. Obviously, France has a different tradition of protest from us anyway. But the coalition of people who take part in these protests is very different from the UK. It's not just middle-class people from the West Country with postgraduate degrees. It's people who are organic farmers. The Confédération Paysanne, which is the Peasants' Confederation in France, are a huge part of the coalition taking part in environmental protest over there. There's way more people from the left who take part in environmental protest over there. And they protest in much more kinetic and visceral ways, and there's a sense there that they really feel that there are changes happening that they need to try and fight against. Whereas in this country, the changes so far are theoretical. The fear so far is of something that's not quite happened, and so the activism is correspondingly, I think, less radical.
So I think we're coming to the end of things. I wanted to thank each of you for coming to our first Hothouse panel event. Dior and I, obviously Diora's not here, she's away, but we really wanted to reiterate how much fun we've had this year, getting to know you guys, building this community. I think working in a lot of media stuff, you kind of feel like you're throwing it out there and you never really see where it's going, and it can become quite lonely and quite stressful, especially when you're reading stats after stats. And I think this has been such a fulfilling project for us to kind of see you all every 6 weeks and talk about something and have a real discussion and have this lovely, lovely group. In Tori's book, she writes that to tackle the climate crisis, you have to be throwing a better party than those who are destroying the planet. And on that note, we have Jake outside who's going to DJ for the next hour, and you can drink some wine, drink some beers. But it's been lovely to see you all.
Hi, so I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. It's probably time to say some thank yous. So thank you to you for listening to the first episode. Thank you to Second Home for having us. It's such a wonderful venue, and it's really amazing how they were so up for collaborating with us, and we really appreciate them giving us their space and their time and their effort. I'd like to thank everyone from Hothouse who came to the event. It was amazing to see you all, and I'm so proud of the community that we've built. I'd also like to thank Grace and Rollo for doing the sound engineering at the event. My next episode will be coming out next week, and in the meantime, just keep engaging with the Instagram, and see you next week. Bye, guys.